Let me welcome everyone today to a what I think is going to be a very interesting and informative seminar on the whole on a whole series of topics with respect to Europe, our longtime friendship with, and work with Europe and the like. We'll talk a little bit, I think, about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, an organization and what it does, and for some of our younger people here and the interns and the like, I think you'll find it very interesting. And NATO is a very interesting topic all the time because of funding and this and that and so on. But having worked with NATO for many years in very key assignments and having met just about all of the leaders in that era, if we didn't have the NATO alliance, in my opinion, we'd have to invent it because it's a marvelous format for discussion, for sharing opinions, ideas, and thoughts and the like. And it's proven its value time and time again in recent history. So that should be very interesting as well. But more importantly, the purpose I think today, Yona, is, if I understand it correctly, is a follow-on really to our very good discussions we had with our friends from the European Union here just a little while ago, and we met with a number of people, primarily younger people, I would say, from the European Union Parliament and the like. And it was a very interesting discussion up on the 12th floor and the like. And this in a way, is a follow-on to that. So, Yona, I'll turn it over to you on behalf of Mike Schwepman and all. We appreciate you all being here. And Yona, why don't you take over and make it happen?
Well, we'll try to follow you. It's not easy, but at any rate, welcome. I'm the moderator, so-called, and timekeeper, and I'm really delighted to welcome everyone, particularly our very distinguished panel. So let me begin with introducing briefly the panel, and then as a young academic, I will have a very brief footnotes and not deliver, a speech, but provide maybe some preliminary context to our discussion. And obviously, it's a small community, it's a small group here. We try to make sure that we encourage dialogue, conversation, and discussion, and we would like to also make sure that everybody knows about everybody else who is here and what's the purpose of our mission. So let me begin first to introduce the distinguished panel. And since as a academic, I'm non-partisan, so to speak, and we would like to make sure that we open up a discussion in any direction that will take us. So to my right, again, not politically, and all of them are friends and colleagues, but particularly with Mike Wine right here, who is the UK member of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe, and we'll introduce him a little bit later on, again in different contexts. So is to my right. To my left, again, not politically, I'm delighted to welcome Eric Bredberg, who is the director of the European Program and a fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And particularly in this case, I'm delighted because I think it personifies the mission, the academic mission that we have in terms of training the next generation of scholars and professionals. General Eric was an intern here. Why don't you tell them a little bit, if you wish? He was an intern here and a research assistant, and he was instrumental also in paving some relationships with Sweden, his country, and at that time we decided that we have to put some emphasis on our work with Europe. So we're delighted that he continues with his important academic work. Now, welcome. I think Dr. Oli Jehan Robert also needs no introduction in Washington. She's associated with SAIS, the School of International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. She was a fellow of the French embassy there, and she continues the association with them, and she also worked extensively, obviously, in Europe. So we will have also a French perspective. Finally, we have Dr. Ralph Lesser, who is, I would say, both an academic and a diplomat. He has a LLM and a PhD and all that, but he's now the German liaison officer to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And welcome, and we had the pleasure to meet and to have him at many of our events the past almost 2 years or year and a half, something like that.
Yes.
Okay, now, one word about, I think, the rationale for this event. As General Gray mentioned, this is a follow-up to a meeting that we had last month with the new generation of members of parliament of the European Union and member states and all that. But again, I think in terms of our academic work, we're trying to provide some form to discuss some of the major challenges and opportunities related to the counterterrorism issues, and this would be the focus today. We provided some information to you, and obviously the latest terrorist attacks in the UK and in France, in Europe in general, and around the world, obviously triggered not only interest but grave concern. And many people are asking, what's the future? What can we do? Whether it is the elections in the UK now, and I'm sure that Mike will refer to this as well, but what about the counterterrorism relationships in the UK and the European Union and around the world? So I think we'll try to figure out which direction, because we're now at a crossroad. So this is really the purpose, I think, of our discussion. Now, again, in terms of the participants, those who are here, obviously we're delighted that we do have our colleagues from the Potomac Institute, some of the fellows here that certainly we welcome their participation, and also members of the staff. I see Catherine just came in, wonderful. And obviously we encourage them to speak. Also, we're delighted to have here a representative from a number of selected embassies to come to discuss from Europe and elsewhere to participate in our dialogue. They will have an opportunity to do that. And last but not least, we're delighted to welcome the new group of our interns for the summer, who are coming from different universities in the United States, and actually representing also countries from Europe, for example, from Bulgaria. Where are you? Okay, we'll later on introduce them. Don't go away. So I think we should have a very useful discussion. Now, two other quick points that are important, at least for me. One is related to the anniversary, I think, dates that we try always to learn the lessons. And obviously there are many, we can spend hours to look at what had happened in the month of June. But in general, we have to see the forest and not only the trees, meaning that when we discuss Europe, we really have to go all the way back in terms of what had happened over a century ago, in terms of the challenges at that time, including the First World War, the interwar period, the Cold War, and the other wars, and so on and so forth. But we are focusing now on the terrorist threats, and as always, we'd like to express our condolences to the victims, the families, whether they're in the UK or they're in Sweden or France or Germany or Sri Lanka or other countries around the world.
Iran also.
I'm sorry?
Iran also.
Well, okay. We have a Iran expert on Iran that will certainly discuss it. I agree. The point about Iran, again, you know, you triggered something on that. But clearly, we're talking about human beings, and members of parliament were attacked and innocent people. But I think it is also a reminder to the government, I think, of Iran. That's my personal, professional view, that no one is immune, including countries that they perpetrate terrorism. And clearly, Iran is the foremost country in the world today. There are some others, but at any rate, that continues daily. And a few members of the Hezbollah, for example, supported by Iran, were just arrested in the United States. We're talking about contemporary situation. We can go back some 35 years or 40 years to discuss it. So number one, condolences. Number two, we always acknowledge the contribution of the leadership of the countries who combat terrorism, the law enforcement, the first responders, the military, the police, and so forth. Tragically, to come back to what you said, Milton, I would like to mention that just now in Australia, where the football games are being held, and there was supposed to be a memorial to the victims of terrorism, including an attack in Melbourne just recently, a couple of days ago. And the decision was of the organizers to have a minute of silence. So the Australian team stood in silence. But the other team, the Saudi Arabian team, did not. They refused, actually, to express their condolences. So what else is new, in a way? Okay, finally, I would like to mention on a personal note for transparency that as an academic, of course, we had opportunities to work with Europe for decades, but more importantly, on a personal level, I would like to report that Europe is part of myself and my family, and we actually have members of the family scattered throughout Europe, those who survived, some 10 countries, including the countries that are represented here, the UK and Sweden and France and Germany, and many, many others. I won't list them now, but to indicate that we're discussing not specifically the national concern, but also the regional and the global. In other words, the globalization and the brutalization of terrorism. Now, I would like to invite our speakers to make initial statements. Later on, we'll develop a discussion, obviously, and we would appreciate if you would identify yourself, and again, ask a question or make a comment, whatever it is. So let's begin with Mike. Again, on a personal level, I'm delighted that he was able to come in his official capacity. He will tell you probably about the nature of the responsibilities, but more so because we had an opportunity to work as academics, as professionals in the UK for many decades. Mike?
Thank you, Yona. Good morning. Yona described me as the UK member of ECRI, which is the Human Rights Monitoring Commission of the Council of Europe, which I am. Every member state nominates a member, and we're appointed by the foreign ministers, and our task is to advise governments on human rights issues. But for 30 years I've been employed and continue to be employed by the Community Security Trust, which is the defence and security agency of the Jewish community in the UK. You have nothing like it in the US, although other European countries have something similar to us. We are a civil society organisation. We are funded by the Jewish community, although we manage government funds to enhance the security of the Jewish community and its institutions. And we provide security advice and training. We also do research. We are researching threats to the Jewish community, and the product of our research goes both to community leadership but to government and law enforcement. And we have a contractual relationship with the police in Britain. We share, and they share with us, data on incidents but also intelligence. And we not only deal with the police, but we deal with other branches of government. So in that sense, we are quite unique, I think, in Europe. I'm also attached to the OSCE, and for the last 18 months I've been helping to draft a policy advisory to governments on security of Jewish communities. So it reminds them of their legal and convention responsibilities, but also provides a lot of practical guidance on security for Jewish communities and how we can transpose best practice to all Council of Europe, all OSCE member states. And I was at the launch 2 weeks ago in the Bundestag in Berlin, and I'm going to speak at the second launch, the diplomatic and law enforcement community in Vienna on the 7th of July. So that's me. What do I want to talk about? Well, the title of this session is about the US and European strategies. So I'm no expert on American strategies, although I'm here every year, usually talking to DOJ, Counter-Terrorism Division, and some of the agencies, based on my perspective. I should add that I no longer have an operational role, but I was involved in the early stages of our PREVENT mechanism, which is the strategy for dealing with radicalization, and some other means British government and law enforcement and security services established. So I look at it from that perspective rather than from being operational now. So with that said, let me make a few points about European strategies. The first is that the member states of the European institutions, that's the EU and the Council of Europe, which doesn't really deal with security, but the OSCE, which does, are responsible for security. That is a matter that is reserved to member states. They have primary responsibility for security in their countries. But having said that, there has been a tremendous move to put in place multilateral cooperation through means of a series of agreements at EU level primarily. The OSCE Counter-Terrorism initiative primarily exists as a forum for the exchange of best practice. It has no operational legal role, whereas those of the European Union, the European Commission do. And these are binding agreements. So a series of agreements. For example, the first, 2005, the counter-terrorism strategy, amongst other things, identified preventing terrorism as a major plank of one of its 4 major planks of strategy for member states to focus on. And then there was a second agreement in 2014, and what interests me particularly was the agreement of 2015 on security, which strengthened cross-border action, enhanced the role of the Schengen Agreement, which I may come back to in a moment, improved internal and external security cooperation, and sought to persuade member states to reduce the silo thinking between internal security and external intelligence work, so that everybody is working on issues rather than within their own particular organizational framework. The PRUM framework, which comes after that, was a means to exchange data, forensic data, DNA, fingerprints, between EU member states, criminal records, information systems, passenger name sharing. All of these operational issues were dealt with by the 2015 agreement. And it works. Although in the last few days we've seen somehow it didn't work between Italy and the UK. In the case of Yusuf Zagba, the Italians say that under the Schengen Agreement they warned the UK about one of the 3 guys that attacked people on Westminster Bridge, and the British are being mute about it. But I can explain, I think, why that was the case in a few minutes. Another agreement, the Strategy on Violent Radicalization of 2016, multifaceted, looking in particular at radicalization and de-radicalization and the means to combat radicalization, and enhancing the RAN network. I don't know if anybody is aware of the RAN, or if not, I can explain it in more detail, but it stands for Radical Awareness Network, and it's an umbrella institution for the exchange of best practice between European states, between states and between civil society organizations on how best to deal with de-radicalization. I was involved in one of the early de-radicalization initiatives, which had its origins in one of the quite successful de-radicalization strategies adopted by the Dutch government, the Amsterdam model. And you can see echoes of that in the Copenhagen model and the Aarhus model, which bring together a range of social services to channel potential radicals away from terrorism. They have police involvement, of course, but often they are led by local authorities, by municipal authorities. In the UK, there's a statutory responsibility on local authorities to appoint people, a team to deal with prevent, as there's also a statutory duty on education institutions, both schools and universities. In the case of universities, it's been a little bit contentious because they regard it as spying on their students. But nevertheless, the prevent strategy, I think, works. A subset, if you like, of prevent, and you know that prevent is one of the strands of our counter-terrorism strategy, which is known as the acronym of contest. But one of the strands of that prevent initiative is channel, which focuses on individuals who may be on the path to becoming terrorists. You think like a conveyor belt, and the role of channel is to divert them off that. I can't talk too much about it, A, because the subjects of channel have not committed crimes. They are people who may be on their way to committing crimes, and therefore, in that sense, they're innocent, and the name's not publicised. Second, there's a high degree of secrecy around it, but I can say that I've been involved in a channel operation where somebody who was under surveillance and his emails and his internet access was being monitored, and it was clear that this person was well on the path to creating IEDs. Where he was going to use them, it was too early to say, but given that his name never appeared in the news, I assumed that the intervention was successful and that he was channeled away from the path that he was embarked on. So that's the sort of the major issue. In terms of strategy, there are institutions which carry forward these agreements at European level. Of course, one of the most important is the Schengen Agreement, which is the borderless Europe, which means that between member states of the European Union there are no borders, and the border is an external border, but it allows free travel, but it also has been enhanced to allow the exchange of information on people who are suspicious, and each member state will have a watch list of people who are regarded as being extremists or even gone further along that path. And so Schengen is the means by which information and intelligence is shared. There's Europol, which is the European Police Agency, which is the operational arm, which brings together, it has representatives of all the member states' police agencies working in The Hague, and which has an increasing operational role, particularly with regards to counter-terrorism. There's Eurojust at the judicial level, which allows the exchange of information between the courts and the judiciary at a European level. And lastly, CEPOL, Centre Européen de Police, which for 25 years was headquartered in the UK, but UK never made very much of it. It's now headquartered in Budapest and has been given an enhanced role. And they are doing training across Europe for police officers and others from the law enforcement community on aspects of counter-terrorism. So if you look at their agenda, their programs that they are offering to police force, you will see, for example, they will run a week's course on how to penetrate terrorist groups using the internet, how to do counter-radicalization work on the internet, all these sorts of operational aspects which are required for counter-terrorism. Having said all that, that there is a European strategy and that by and large it does work, it's the failures we hear about rather than the successes. It's also important to say that bilateral communications are equally important, if not more important. The former head of counter-terrorism, Richard Walton, published a couple of weeks ago a paper, and it's based on the presentation he did at the ICT conference, the Global Forum on Counter-Terrorism, held in Herzliya in Israel this past summer, where he was stressing the value of bilateral relationships between law enforcement and security services. In other words, if you have somebody that you are looking at and you're suspicious about him and you know that he's come from another state, you either work through your officer who is stationed in the police headquarters of that country or their representative in your police HQ, and this exists across Europe. Everybody's got policemen and security service representatives in everybody else's country, in their headquarters, or you just pick up the phone and say, X is a person of interest to us. What can you tell me? What can you send me? So Richard was talking about the importance of bilateral relationships and how, in a sense, they shortcut the multilateral relationships, which often have to go through institutions. In other words, either the person-to-person contact or the agency-to-agency contact. And, he was saying that this, in many ways, produces more immediate results because you build up personal rapport, understanding with your opposite number in other countries. So, by way of summary, I would say that that there is a European strategy. It's based on a number of agreements, a number of operational institutions, that generally it works well. The problems, the faults, if you like, that occur are where that information doesn't get passed on fast enough, goes to the wrong people, or because of the sheer volume. I mean, the UK, we talk about something like 20,000 people who are in some sense or another suspect because they're engaged in extremist activity, of which about 3,000 are regarded as potential terrorists who have to be investigated. We also had 800 people who'd gone as volunteers to ISIS in Syria and Iraq. A number have come back, not all of course, are potential terrorists. Some may have gone for humanitarian reasons, some may have said, well, I've done my bit, I just want to go back to a normal life. 50 or so at least have been killed, but nevertheless, we're talking about several thousand people who are potentially engaged or likely to be engaged in terrorism, and this represents a phenomenal problem for security services and police services. I mean, who do you prioritize, given that if you want to put someone under surveillance, you want to follow them, you want to see where they're going, who they're talking to, what they're doing, who they're communicating with, you need a team of 20 to 30 people at any one time. And security services therefore have to prioritize, and sometimes they get it wrong, and that may have happened in recent weeks, recent months. So having said that, just a couple of words about the recent threats in the UK. Last year at this ICT conference, which I mentioned, which is probably the largest counter-terrorism gathering in the world, with 1,000, 1,500 participants over 4 days, with a range of participants from academics to police officers, to security services, intelligence services, journalists, a very wide array, but nevertheless often some people who are really knowledgeable, who are practitioners, who are really worth talking to. And last year there was a presentation by the deputy head of the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst of Germany, the head of counter-terrorism, talking about the assessment that over the course of the next couple of years, at least 6 European states will be targeted by IS terrorists, and that there is an awareness that each have connections, whether it's in the form of cells or connections, internet or otherwise, or face-to-face connections with people in each of those states, either because they had gone to Syria, Iraq, been radicalized, come back, and not been detected, or because they were being radicalized in situ, often over the internet, but not always, because it needs face-to-face contacts for that connection to be cemented. But so he was warning that there is a long-term problem in Europe, and we, my organisation, who have a very close connection with the British police, have been the recipients of a series of warnings going back now 18 months. They've been saying to us continuously, look, we're expecting something, don't lower your guard. And the government, fortunately, has followed through. I say we manage funds for the government which are used to enhance the security of Jewish institutions. We're now advising other non-Jewish institutions. For example, one of my colleagues was doing a workshop with representatives of the churches last week, because, as you know, IS target not only governments, people, Jews, but also Christians. You recall the murder of the Catholic priest in Normandy last year, but there were also several attempted murders in Indonesia last year by ISIS representatives against clergymen. So the churches are also targets for IS, and given the fact that we've been in this business for 30 years, we are very happy to offer up the experience, and the government asks us to offer experience to others beyond our own small community. So the recent attacks, the Westminster Bridge on the 22nd of March with Khalid Massoud, initially thought to be lone operator, but subsequently it turns out that he had connections, and I would suggest that very few terrorist attacks are carried out by lone wolves, lone operators these days. Investigations, which can take years to work through, almost always reveal that there are connections, either online or organizational, with the people that carry out the terrorist attacks. I was in Toulouse November last year, police meeting talking about security, and one of the participants was the lead investigator into the Mohammed Merah murders in Toulouse. Remember, he killed a couple of soldiers, and then he went to the Jewish school, to Torah school, and killed one of the teachers and 3 small children. And it was believed for quite a long time that he was a lone operator, but in fact he was an Al-Qaeda operative, and he said, the policeman said, it's taking years to trace all of these connections and in what way Merah was connected with the organization on whose behalf he was carrying out this attack. So that was the Westminster Bridge incident. The May incident in Manchester Arena, with Salman Abedi, again thought to be a lone operator. It turns out that there's a whole, one's known for a long time that there's a whole grouping of Libyan exiles in South Manchester, and that many of them are from the Ikhwan, from the Muslim Brotherhood, and his parents, or his father at least, was an Ikhwan activist, and that members, as one knows, that people from IS have gone from Syria, Iraq, back to Libya, and that there are 3 separate IS groupings in Syria, and Abedi was probably trained. I mean, he had an IED, so it wasn't a stabbing or a hostile vehicle attack. This was a sophisticated attack, and therefore must have got some training when he went back to Libya last time. So that, again, not a lone wolf, and perhaps different from the Westminster Bridge attack and the London Bridge attack, 10 days ago, where you had 3 guys, and again, there's arrests because there's a network, but here there's an interesting connection that they all come out of Al-Muhajiroun, which is a radical group which is actually banned, and its subsequent iterations, if you like, have also been banned, but which has been one of the crucial factors in radicalizing young Muslims to then go on to become terrorists. And all of these were part of the Al-Muhajiroun Network. So, of course, the investigations now reveal that two of them, or at least one of them, Khurram Butt, was an Al-Muhajiroun activist who featured on a Channel 4 documentary 2 years ago. So in that sense, he was known and had been warned about by moderate Muslims on several occasions. One guy, the Zagba, the use of Zagba, the Italian was the subject of Italian police inquiries, and they, through the Schengen Agreement, had say that they had warned the British about him. And the third one, Redouane, who had been banned from the UK or excluded from the UK, who'd gone to Ireland, married a British woman in Ireland, and therefore was able to get back into England on a British passport. So all of these people have backgrounds. They're not just people who suddenly are radicalized and flip. They've all got histories. I said these are all cases where, when you look at them, there is history, but it takes a while to uncover this history. My fear is, and it's based on our own research, my colleagues' research, and the warnings that we're receiving from the police, my fear is that this is a problem that's going to be with us really for some time. It's not just people returning from Syria and Iraq who've been fighting for IS. It's people who are being radicalized in situ and who then go on to commit acts of terrorism. And in that radicalization process, at some point, somebody recruits them and then gives them some direction. So my prognosis is not a terribly positive one, but nevertheless, I think there are ways to mitigate the threat, and it really requires very close and continuing cooperation between law enforcement, security services, and civil society to ensure that the public at large are aware of the threat without being scared witless, but are aware of the threats and can themselves take action to mitigate them.
Thank you very much, Mike. Obviously, we'll come back to many of the issues that you mentioned and some others. For example, the likely impact of the elections in the UK that were held yesterday on the counter-terrorism activities, both internally and externally, but we'll come back to you. I want to move on with our other panelists. And next, Eric, it's your floor, and as I mentioned before, it is really a pleasure to see somebody who decided to focus on this and to continue your mission, and obviously comes back many of the activities that we were involved with. I just want to mention one ongoing activity with Sweden, if I may. Our journal on minority and group rights, ethnic, racial, religious intolerance, violence, that we are publishing now with the University of Lund, Malmö, with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on Human Rights. We began with 1991, and we still continue. Unfortunately, one of the root causes, as we know, is ethnic, racial, religious, tribal, if you will, and national extremism, but we'll come back to it. Eric, please tell us what's on your agenda.
Sure. Well, it's really delighted to be here and to be back here. I started my career in research working with Dr. Alexander over a decade ago, so it's really tremendously an honor for me to be back, and very much that was an impetus for me pursuing research on international security. So really an honor to be here. I think Michael covered a lot of ground in terms of the evolution and origins of EU counterterrorism strategy, which I was planning to talk about, but I think instead of repeating his excellent overview, I think I'll focus on two things, and I'll keep it very brief so that we can have a conversation. I think, first of all, Michael talked a lot about counterterrorism cooperation within the European Union, which is obviously hugely important, but I think there's another element which is also the EU's and European countries' efforts to promote counterterrorism strategies in third countries outside of Europe. So I'll just start and say a few words on that. And this is obviously an activity that sort of corresponds with the evolution of the EU's internal counterterrorism strategies. Post 9/11, we've seen the European Union, both in terms of the EU institutions, but also obviously individual member states, increasingly including counterterrorism as part of broader stabilization and assistance efforts, primarily or particularly in Europe's southern neighborhood and sort of the regions surrounding Europe, but also going beyond in places like Pakistan. So we've seen external assistance in terms of counterterrorism, covering areas such as justice, human rights, law enforcement, but also education, media, transportation, and so forth. And the type of activities that the EU has been involved in includes judicial capacity building, obviously police and law enforcement assistance, border management. The EU's own CSDP tool hasn't really been used for counterterrorism purposes, but it certainly could have an application there. We've also seen increasingly in the EU's political dialogue with third states that counterterrorism has increasingly over the past decade become part of the agenda as one of the topics that are being talked about. And of course, we've also seen the EU adopting counterterrorism clauses very much along the lines of the UN's legal framework for counterterrorism as part of its external work as well, and also including sanctions in its relations with third countries. So there's been this evolution, if you will, of the EU as a global counterterrorism actor. In addition to that, as I mentioned, of course, you have individual EU member states that also has a focus on counterterrorism in its relations with other countries, sometimes at odds, perhaps, with what the European Union is doing, sometimes as a complement to what the EU is doing. Certainly, European countries with deep historical ties or colonial ties to certain countries, such as in North Africa, are able to utilize those relationships in promoting counterterrorism work. I think I mentioned Pakistan. The UK in particular has been very active in Pakistan over the years. So this is another aspect of Europe's efforts to promote counterterrorism vis-a-vis third states. Because we're here also talking about transatlantic cooperation, I'll just say a few words about that. I think sort of at the same time you've seen the evolution of the EU as a counterterrorism actor, both within Europe and externally. You've obviously seen much closer cooperation over the years between the US and the United States on counterterrorism, things like the passenger name records, for instance, things like the Container Security Initiative that's sort of about border security. You've seen cooperation on SWIFT and trying to counter terrorist financing, information sharing. So there's been this evolution of EU-US counterterrorism as well that I think is very important to highlight. Not always easy, not always straightforward, but nevertheless a very important aspect. And also cooperation between Europol and Eurojust and its US equivalents. And I'm sure Ralph can talk much more about these sorts of things. In addition to this, and going back again to sort of the EU's external work, I do think it's important to also mention the role of military in countering terrorism. I think in here, I would argue that you've almost seen, especially in more recent years, almost a convergence perhaps of US and European approaches, where the US maybe traditionally has been more comfortable with sort of applying military tools for counterterrorism purposes, whereas Europeans have traditionally focused on some of these more, if you will, soft power efforts that I've outlined. But I think there has been a growing appreciation in at least some European capitals about the applicability of military tools also for counterterrorism purposes. And certainly over the past few years, we've seen several European countries being willing to contribute to certainly the counter-ISIL coalition in Syria and Iraq, but also more broadly being able to carry out training and assistance, security sector reform to improve the local counterterrorism capacity also for the local military in third states. So that's an important aspect as well. I did want to also comment briefly because the general also brought up NATO and the role of NATO. So I think that's another aspect that I just want to highlight. Obviously, NATO was not designed and created to deal with counterterrorism. It's still not the primary focus. However, if you read NATO strategic documents, terrorism has been part of the conversation going back to the 90s, if you look at NATO strategic concepts. And obviously, post 9/11 and the ISAF mission in Afghanistan, while not focused primarily on terrorism, I think increased the sentiment that this should be one of the aspects that NATO should deal with, especially in both using intelligence sharing to use NATO as a platform and a vehicle for counterterrorism work internally, but also as part of the NATO's broader global commitment. And I know Dr. Alexander has also edited a book on NATO's global security role. I think, there is an expectation from the new Trump administration that NATO should take on a larger counterterrorism role. We saw this at the NATO summit in Brussels recently, statements about NATO stepping up its role in counterterrorism, joining officially the counter-ISIL coalition, not as not to directly carry out strikes, but to be part of the coalition and be able to contribute in other ways. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, to what extent NATO will be able to do more on counterterrorism, especially in Europe's immediate neighborhood. Already it is doing quite a lot in terms of the things that I mentioned earlier, technical assistance, security training, support, and so on and so forth. But I think there is going to be a growing demand, and I think this is also where you maybe will see differences not only between U.S. expectations in Europe, but also within Europe. Southern member states that are perhaps exposed to terrorism, some of the states that have unfortunately had terrorist attack in recent months and years are maybe more prone to the idea of using NATO as a vehicle and a tool for addressing this challenge, whereas other states, maybe primarily Central Eastern European states, would like to sort of maintain the focus on more sort of traditional defense, territorial defense against Russia, rather than deviating into counterterrorism. So I think this is going to be very much an ongoing conversation within Europe, but also across the Atlantic, that I think we'll continue to watch. But I do think that the expectations from the new U.S. administration is that this is an area where they would like to see a bigger role for NATO going forward. So I think I'll end it on there, and I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Eric. Obviously, we were very much interested in the work that you're doing under the European umbrella, but actually your offices in Europe, whether it is in Moscow or elsewhere, and I think that's the way to build the bridges with the transatlantic relationships. And that's why I think our focus today is the European perspective, but again, in terms of the U.S. new administration relationships, and we'll come back to that. Our next panelist, Dr. Robert here, as I mentioned before, she is uniquely qualified, if I may use that term, to deal with this, because not only that she was trained, she's French, in France, but also in Geneva, and the university, the graduate school, and all that, and there are really very, I think, outstanding institutions, but she had the opportunity academically also to study and to write and publish on this particular issues, the transatlantic issue, the EU-US cooperation in conflict prevention management, for example, and the whole cultural issues in terms of radicalization, immigration, and so forth. We can spend a semester at least to deal with that, but you can speak as long as you want, but try to finish in 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'd like also to thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor being among you today. And I think it was kind of crucial, actually, to have this very timely discussion. So I'm glad to be here. So after these two very impressive and informative talks, I'm going to try to keep my remarks very brief.
Right.
Initially. So I'm just going to focus actually on CVE efforts in order to complement what has been said. Just maybe a few comments before focusing on counter-violent extremism. about the European counter-terrorism strategy, just to provide you maybe with a bit of historical context, because I do think it's important to clarify a few points for the discussion. So it is in 2004, actually, that the EU undertook tackling terrorism as a common security threat. It happened following, as you may remember, the attacks in Madrid, the coordinated bombings in commuter trains that had killed almost 200 people and injured around 2,000 people. So very briefly, in 2005, the EU adopted the Hague Programme to strengthen freedom, security, and justice in the European Union. In 2007, the Council approved the revised Radicalization and Recruitment Action Plan, and it is in 2011 only that the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN, that Mr. Wine mentioned, has been finally launched. But it is only in 2015 that real and effective changes were adopted following the so-called Charlie Hebdo attacks, so in Paris, which happened in on January 7, 8, and 9th, and where actually 17 people were killed. So these attacks, of course, shocked the entire world, as you may remember, but they also, in a certain way, became a kind of game changer in European counter-terrorism policy. So since the EU reinforced its commitment to fight terrorism and prevent violent extremism, and one of the most important acts of this policy has become CVE efforts, as you said. Soft power, I might disagree with this part, but counter-violent extremism for sure. So what does it mean in practice? Well, actually, I'm afraid that my response to that question will be a little bit less positive than the one from Mr. Wine. There is indeed a European strategy. Is it working? I don't know. I would say they are like mixed results. So first, it should be noted that the priorities highlighted by the European Commission in response to the Paris shootings are everything but new. Most of them predated the so-called Charlie Hebdo events. So for instance, I'm just going to mention, take one example, the Justice and Home Affairs Council conclusions of December 2014, which adopted the guidelines for the EU strategy for combating radicalization and recruitment of terrorism, we love like long titles all the time, were intended to implement the revised EU strategy, which has been adopted by the Council in 2014, but in practice it only supplemented the first strategy issued 10 years earlier in 2005, actually. So this is just an example, but I think, unfortunately, it is very revealing of the way that the EU has been implementing its strategy. So also the role of the EU is legally bounded, as I'm sure you all know, to offering guidance, resources, and a framework for coordination. Unfortunately, in terms of coordination, the lack of data also make us have a kind of mixed assessment about results. So authorities have to acknowledge the fact that Western European countries as a whole have been experiencing a generalized identity crisis affecting not only number of second or third generation Muslim, as we often hear in the press, but youth as a whole. So in 2015, just to give you, to provide you with an estimated number, we were talking about 5,000 so-called European foreign fighters. So just a quick comment on that. The term European foreign fighters is not even accurate any longer because there's been, counter-terrorism strategy should evolve much more quickly actually than they do, because the problem is that attacks and strategies from ISIS do evolve extremely quickly as well. And we're not facing European foreign fighters any longer. We're facing attacks from people coming from, nationals actually, especially in France. It's been very striking to see that now we have also young French people becoming assailants, even raised in Christian families. So this is just a brief comment. I think we're going to develop that and probably have more time to mention that during the Q&A session, but I think this is something that we should definitely keep in mind. So in order to stem this pool, both in France and in Europe, it is extremely important to undertake efforts to make the Muslim identity compatible with the European national, gender, and ethnic ones. However, these efforts, although needed, will only meet part of the problem because it is extremely important to acknowledge the fact that violent extremism is a complex phenomenon. We all know that, but it is not a religious problem. It is actually a radical ideology manipulating religion, so in this case Islam, of course, to indoctrinate, recruit, and make young people serve a cause until death. Therefore, it is crucial, in my opinion, to tackle the issue with a broader perspective, to be able to confront and counter the existential recognition promised by jihadists. So ISIS has been playing on many promises, actually, belonging to democratic Western values. I think we'll have time probably to get back to that during the discussion, but this is extremely important. I'm not going to get into details. I will refer to the study published in 2016 by the Carter Center in Atlanta. But just very briefly, when we study actually the propaganda and the master narratives, as we call them, of ISIS propaganda, it is extremely striking to notice that the most important criteria is actually the humiliation of the transnational Muslim community, so the so-called Ummah, the desire also to humiliate the West and the military jihad, but there are also narratives promising actually better social services, better justice, and also calling, of course, playing the card of religious appeal. So there is an urgent need, in my opinion, to develop counter-messaging strategies to discredit this precise rhetoric, and also to address the rise of Islamophobia in Europe, because as surprising as it might be when we're talking about counter-terrorism strategy, actually many scholars have demonstrated that Islamophobia and basically extremism are the two faces of the same coin in a certain way. So changing the narrative would promote agents of conflict transformation, and it is something that we should definitely think of right now. So time is almost off, so I'm just gonna move very quickly to my conclusion. So countering violent extremism requires action both at the national and at the international level. Individual efforts will not suffice. This is a time for determined multilateral action, and there is a critical need for information sharing, as you said, cross-border and cross-cultural collaboration. So countering violent extremism, especially in Europe, requires not only a military response, but coordinated intelligence efforts and much more logistical means and man, but it also requires cultural initiatives implemented, of course, jointly to security measures. So due to the specific nature of European radicalization and violent extremism, it is crucial to drastically develop and implement prevention strategies. It is important to keep in mind that violent extremism and Islamophobia, as I said, are the two faces of the same coin, and both should be targeted simultaneously. So second, there is a need, and this will be like my conclusion, there is a need of ensuring civil interventions are properly targeted and do not stigmatize the communities from whom cooperation is needed. To be effective, civil initiatives should focus on both governing institutions and communities to rebuild trust as well. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll certainly continue to have a dialogue related to France. And again, I mean, we see it almost in terms of a daily challenge, what happened in Notre Dame Church. People are saying, why are you excited about that? Well, it's not only the immediate potential victim, the policeman using primitive, what we call quote-unquote weapon, but the hundreds of people were in the church. They had to put their hands on the red, and the fear, and to intimidate the entire society.
And by the way, can I come in?
Sure,
By the way, the attacker by Notre Dame lived in Sweden. I'm originally Swedish and spoke Swedish, and was a man who was very well educated. He worked or had worked for the Swedish National Public Radio Station. So he was well employed, well educated, and working as a journalist. And still, and I think it goes to your point, it shows the ability of this jihadist ideology to penetrate even a person like that to then be able to carry out an attack. So it's a good case.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that kind of, I think, relationships. And I would like to move on to Germany, then we'll develop discussion. And it reminds me, Eric, in Germany, there were a number of incidents, not only in Germany itself, but the international one, 1972, the Munich Olympics, that put on the stage of the world the collaboration of terrorists and the Black September that were able to kill 11 athletes. And Germany at the time was not prepared to deal with this. So again, as participant observer, we were able to work with academics as well as the law enforcement to develop a counterterrorism strategy. The other event that comes to mind is the June 1976 hijacking of the Air France airliner by the Baader-Meinhof of members, as well as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, hijacked that airplane. It was brought to Uganda, and then the Israelis were able to rescue the hostages. And so again, we're still dealing with the aviation security issue. I'm really delighted that you were able to come and join us again in your capacity as a German officer, liaison officer with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the counterterrorism issues, but also welcome as an academic and professional, a lawyer. We have a few lawyers here too in the same boat, that clearly with your background you can provide some clarity to what's going on. So again, you can speak for as long as you want, but the same, I cannot discriminate, but you have about 10 minutes initially, and then we'll develop the discussion. Okay?
Thank you, Yona, for this kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's an honor. I guess the excellent statements of the other speakers have significantly increased the chance that I will make it within my 10 minutes, because a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said in a very brilliant way. As a German liaison officer to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, I have three hats on. I'm a German, I'm a European, and I'm, of course, very close when it comes to the transatlantic cooperation. So I would like to first emphasize a couple of things regarding the EU and the German strategy on counterterrorism, and then talk a bit about our cooperation with the US. Regarding the European institutions and their counter strategy and CVE strategy, a lot has been said already, and I don't want to repeat that, but what I would like to highlight is that back then in the 70s, you mentioned the horrible attacks in Munich and the Rote Armee-Fraktion, the RAF in Germany, a left terrorist organization. We had a huge shift in counterterrorism laws and strategies, and my impression is, when I look at the German and European situation today, that we have a similar development given the challenges and the threats of the last 2 or 3 years. So I think the European security architecture has changed a whole lot, and we are not talking about a shift quantity-wise, but I think there's a quality-related change. And in particular, when it comes to data collection and sharing, information sharing, I think whenever you talk to CT experts, they will tell you information sharing is key. And we as Europeans, and in particular Germans, I have to say, due to our history, we have a very difficult approach to the collection of data and to information sharing. While, and I'm simplifying here, I hope the historians in the room will apologize, but while American history has taught you the lesson that the biggest threat there is might be a terrorist coming, from the inside or from the outside. History in Germany and Europe has taught us, after two dictatorships in the last century in Germany, that the state and the government can be the biggest threat for citizens. So that's why we have a very restrictive data protection law. And I'm mentioning this because that has changed to a certain, and from a law enforcement perspective, very valuable degree. And you can show that when you look at measures like the collection of passenger name records, or when you look at the introduction of minimum retention periods for communication traffic in the internet. Both topics deal with the collection of data of innocent people who are not even suspicious of a crime or even a terrorist attack. They're simply flying in a plane, they're simply using the internet, and nonetheless their data is being collected. That is a huge step regarding the history and taking into consideration where we come from. And those questions have been heavily debated, and that those laws have passed in the European Parliament and also in the German Parliament, just like in the other member states' parliaments, is something which politicians and CT experts were not sure about and could not expect to happen, let's say, a couple of years ago. Those topics have been debated in Parliament, before the Constitutional Court, before the European Court of Justice. They are very controversial, and the European Union and the member states have moved a whole lot when letting those laws enter into force and taking into consideration the new security threat we are facing. Thus, what I want to say is that the balance between liberty and security, which always has to be rebalanced, it's a constant balancing. It's not a single day process, but this balance has been shifted given the new threats. Same is true with regard to the Schengen information system, which has been already mentioned, which now contains much more CT-related information and also fingerprints. The role and the power of Europol, and especially when it comes to information sharing between member states, has significantly increased in the last 2 years. Much more data is being shared, and because that's the case, the Europol database gets more valuable for everybody, and that's why much more data will be shared in the near future. So it's a self-improving system, if you want. I would like to say one or two words to CVE. Basically, Odd has brilliantly stated whatever needed to be stated. I think because you mentioned the EU strategy is not as successful as it could be, I think it's also important to highlight that CVE and preventional measures by definition have to be carried out on the ground. That's street work. So the European Union can give support to the member states, and even I, as a representative of the German government, of the German federal government, have to say that our role more or less is a very supporting one as well, because at the end it's going to be done on a federal state level by local networks which work together with the various stakeholders. You might have heard of the Violent Prevention Network in Hesse, or of Hayat, which I think is quite known here in the US as well. Those are very local networks who deal with circumstances which they know best because they are closest, and which they know better than I could ever do as a federal government official or as a European Union could do. So I think it's by nature a federal system, and that's why the influence of the European Union on this topic has to be little, or we should not overestimate or over-exaggerate our expectation towards the European Union on that, because that's street work. I would like to let you know a bit about my daily work with the American authorities, in particular with DHS. And from my point of view, we have a very close cooperation on all levels. That includes intelligence. That includes law enforcement authorities like our Federal Criminal Police Office, the BKA, and the FBI. We have a liaison officer from BKA here in Washington, D.C., who is in close and daily contact with the FBI. I think I'm the personified example that the cooperation is also working well on a ministerial level. I actually do have an office at the DHS headquarters, so I'm in their building, door to door, working together with my American colleagues, and it's a very intense and helpful cooperation for both sides, I think, and it's something which we are proud of. Our ministry, they do have twice a year meetings on a leadership level, on a deputy secretary level. My minister comes usually once a year. He has been here in the beginning of May recently to meet with Secretary Kelly. So there's a close and regular contact on all levels, and that's very important, and that's something that has not changed under the new administration. I think that's very important to mention, that it would not be correct to have a look at the newspapers and to read about climate change and about certain differences in other fields, and then to assume that this is also true for the field of Homeland Security. No, it's not. We do have a very intense cooperation, and I also have to say that DHS Secretary Kelly personally is very much engaged into this transatlantic cooperation. For example, just a couple of weeks after he entered office, when a couple of executive orders were in the table, and there were very good arguments for him to stay here in the U.S., he said, no, there's going to be this Munich Security Conference. I'm going to be there. And signs like this are shown very often by him, and that's very encouraging, and that's very helpful. He already has a very trustful relationship to my minister. I can say that. They had a couple of phone calls, personal meetings in Munich, here in Washington, and he is someone. You, General Gray, you're nodding your head because generals are said to be able to value good cooperation.
Sergeants before he got commissioned.
I heard that there's the stereotype that generals know about the value of good cooperation and appreciate it a whole lot. And I can say regarding Secretary Kelly, this is absolutely true. And of course, it's also true on our side, even though my Minister of the Interior, Thomas de Maizière, has not been a general, but he was Minister of Defense a couple of years, so maybe that's helpful. But again, that's very important to me to emphasize that there is a constant cooperation, and that this has not been affected by the new administration and challenges we are facing on other topics in the transatlantic relationship. Let me come to an end and just mention the visa waiver program. And I do not mention it because it might be the Achilles heel of the US or a point of weakness, letting foreign fighters or German, European terrorists travel without a visa to the US. That's a common stereotype. And I really would like to emphasize that the opposite is the case. First, if you travel to the US without a visa, from a security angle, there are almost no differences between how you are screened and how you're vetted before entering the country. There's not an interview as you would have when you apply for a visa, but the value of this interview is being denied by almost all security experts, especially if you look at how long a visa is valid, 10 years, and how quickly people radicalized nowadays. So the interview is not a very important factor from a security point of view. What's interesting about the visa waiver program that's almost never mentioned in public debates is that in order to participate in this program, all participating countries have to fulfill certain standards of cooperation. And that led to the consequence that among those, I think it's 36 countries who participate in the visa waiver program, we have very homogeneous standards of cooperation, For example, when it comes to information sharing with Interpol, lost and stolen travel documents. For example, when it comes to information sharing on known or suspected terrorists, the watch listing. For example, when it comes to document security. For example, when it comes to border security. Plus, and that's a very political relevant point, all participating countries have the right to visit other countries and check in those countries whether the conditions are being met. And that's a very helpful approach. The US is making use of this, and that's why DHS, who is in charge of the visa waiver program, knows so much about what's going on in Europe. So the message I would like to send here is that the visa waiver program, different from public debate, is a security program, and it would be a security issue, a security problem, if you would stop or weaken this program. So that's it from my side. I'm looking forward very much to the debate, and I'm sorry I didn't make the 10 minutes.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. You know, it's encouraging what you had to say. Hopefully this can be a model for some other countries. I wonder if I may ask you a question and open it up for discussion. Everybody is asking now, what's next after the elections in the UK yesterday, and would it affect one way or another the counterterrorism issue? And secondly, is there a way for reconciliation between the mayor of London and the president here? That's one of the issues that people are asking.
Okay. Well, we still have to have a government, and Theresa May thinks that she can govern with the support of the Northern Ireland DUP party. They're not so enthusiastic, but we'll see what happens over the course of the next few days. Whatever government gets in, I don't think there will be really any changes in our CT programs. Those are long-standing, they've been enhanced continuously, and generally they work. There are failures, I know, but generally they work. So I don't see any changes in that. As far as Mayor Khan and President Trump are concerned, I think it's just one of those stupidities which has occurred, and I think certainly Mayor Khan in his recent comment on television, I think it was the day before yesterday, or maybe the day before that, said, look, I really haven't got time for all of this. I've got a major city to govern. I've got to get on with business, and let's forget the whole thing.
Okay.
I have to say he's proven to be an extremely effective mayor, and really taken a lead in promoting the role of governance and law enforcement in confronting these terrorism problems.
And the role of community.
Role of community. I mean, we've known him for a long time. I mean, my organisation has known him for a long time. And look, 15 years ago, he was a fairly radical lawyer defending radical Islamists. But he grew up. And you've got to take account that people mature, they develop. That's what he did, and he's turned out to be extremely competent and effective. If I can venture a prophecy, I could see him being a prime ministerial candidate in some years' time.
The thing that I just wanted to come in on is the impact of Brexit on EU counterterrorism. And given the importance that we've discussed, the important role that the EU plays in counterterrorism cooperation in Europe, is there a risk that with the UK leaving, that they would be left out and that this cooperation would be affected? I mean, I think some of the things we've heard earlier this year from the British government in pursuing the sort of hard Brexit option seem to imply that they're willing to use even security cooperation as part of the bargaining chip. I personally don't think we're going to end up there. I think that would be very unfortunate, and I think all parties have nothing to gain from that. So I would be, while I do think Brexit is very unfortunate, I do remain hopeful that there would be a way to find ways to continue cooperating with the UK in the EU framework, even beyond Brexit. And also, of course, some of these cooperation frameworks are not EU specific, like Europol and others are sort of European and transgovernmental, but the UK could still remain even after it would leave the EU an active player on sort of the European level in counterterrorism work. But it is a concern that I think needs to be fleshed out in the coming 2 years.
Thank you very much. I welcome the participation. Just identify yourself for the record, ask a question, make a comment. Can you use the, 1 second, we do have a mic coming. Please.
Could use mine.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Kagan from Johns Hopkins SAIS. And Eric invited me here today, so I'm thankful for that. I wanted to talk about political correctness. And I think this is a problem in the United States and in Europe. And I cite a couple of examples of a Jewish woman who was killed by her Moroccan neighbor in France. And instead of the French call it terrorism, even though she'd been harassed by he and his family for quite some time, they called it mental illness. Jews who were attacked by migrants in Germany, it was not called a hate crime, it was called a mugging. There was, in Sweden, when this occurred in Malmö, it was called just teenagers being teenagers. And so that's one piece of this. And I think words matter. I think words are extremely important. And I think that avoiding calling something what it is, and we had our own problem with Nadel Hassan when President Obama called it workplace violence, as opposed to what it really was at Fort Hood. And I think that this is a real problem, and I think it is exacerbated in certain European countries by creating government community housing for recent migrants where laws of those nations are not being implemented, so that recently in Sweden, they found that a number of people who come have 3 wives. The women are being kept inside. They're not letting to go outside. In Denmark, they agreed to segregate swimming pools and schools and have men only taught by men and women only taught by women. And in Germany, there was the issue of doctors, whether female doctors could see male patients and the like. So are we perpetuating, and Odd, I know you mentioned the cultural piece, but are we perpetuating problems by political correctness and by refusing to call something what it really is?
Okay. Any of you?
Well, thank you very much for your comments. Yes, the response is very simple. Yes, we are. At the same time, it's extremely difficult to speak or to qualify. You mentioned the Jewish crime, and there is no definition, no legal definition of hate crime. So as long as we don't have like a legal definition, internationally speaking, or at the European level, or even like nationally, of what a hate crime is, what do you want to do? This is actually where the main problem is, in order to respond very briefly to that. And also, of course, trends are extremely different depending on, I mean, you mentioned many countries, you mentioned France, you mentioned Germany. And yes, we are facing all kind, as I said, an identity crisis, and there are like some common strands. But at the same time, problems are extremely different in all of these countries. And this would be a huge mistake. We've done this mistake in 2008 when President Sarkozy or Chancellor Merkel and some others kept saying that there was like a failure of European multiculturalism. This was, in my opinion, part of the problem, because just determining and trying to label in a certain way something like as various, because there's no such a thing as European multiculturalism. We had different forms of multiculturalism, and I would need probably like 2 hours to explain that, so I'll try to keep it very brief. But there was like nothing like European multiculturalism. It is absolutely impossible to compare the models that we have, like in the UK, for instance, to the model of integration that we were trying to have like in France. So the first problem is there. So you're right, word matters, and we do need really like to work very hard. But my question would be to get like a proper definition. But my question would be, at which level?
There's no disagreement from me either. I also am concerned that crimes which are motivated by bias, whatever that bias may be, are not investigated in the way they should be and not labelled as they should be. The consequences of hate crime are not just on the individual victim, but onto the individual's community as well. So it has a secondary effect. And dealing with hate crime is a major concern at the moment. And training police to recognize the motivation behind bias attacks is something that the European agencies are focusing on at the moment. But in terms of integrating migrants or people from who come from other countries for whatever reason, I think it's vitally important that that part of that integration process educates them into the cultural and social norms that pertain in that country. That's not to say that they can't practice their religion or the way that they live, but nevertheless, you come to live in my country. These are the norms that we adhere to in this country. These are the attitudes, without imposing any totalitarian view, but these are the norms and the attitudes which we expect of our citizens. And I think that European states only now are beginning to address the issue of integrating migrants who've come to their countries in recent years.
If I may add, because I'm not sure if I agree with your assumption, I do agree that there are cases in which political correctness is an issue, but I'm not sure if that's a general problem and if it's the most important problem we are facing. When you said name things what they are, and well, what is the thing? So if a migrant commits a crime, the chance that newspapers report on that is much higher than when, for example, in Germany, a German citizen commits a crime. The thing is that according to our criminal statistics, migrants are not more criminal than German citizens. And that
any other European state, as far as I'm aware, migrants are not the cause of crime.
Exactly. So they're not the cause of crime. And that's why we do not want to have any stigmatization of migrants in particular, because that would hinder the integration if they are always the bad ones. So if a crime is committed, we clearly have to state who it was. But I don't think we have a political correctness problem there. I have the feeling that the problem comes from another end, which is that migrants, when they commit a crime, are much more in public focus than Germans, and that this leads to a wrong impression that migrants are more criminal. Same with regard to the connection between terrorism and mental illness. We actually do have facts that while the reasons for radicalization may be widespread and different and vary from person to person, the question of the mental illness is a common issue in many cases. And as a matter of fact, we look into options how we as state authorities can cooperate with medical services to find out to receive warning signs from their side when they have people in treatment for mental illnesses who then show signs that they might commit an attack. It's a huge challenge because of course doctors are not allowed to, for good reasons, not allowed to talk about what patients tell them. But just to show you that that the facts show there is a link between the issue of mental illness and terrorism. Not in all cases, of course, I'm not saying that, but in more cases than when we thought would be the case.
Okay.
Just if I may, just one quick comment, because yeah, I do agree with you. There are signs and there are studies about that. At the same time, it would be such a mistake just to say that because of mental illness, we all gonna become a science. So let's be very careful there, because there is, and we will never repeat that enough, there is no monolithic profile of perpetrators or assailants. Absolutely no monolithic profile, and this is why it makes so difficult actually to come up with good preventing strategies.
Thank you. Obviously, we can spend a great deal of time to uh, try to focus on the political correctness, but it is much broader. Actually, we're discussing the conceptual bankruptcy, I think, in terms of who are the terrorists, what are the root causes, and how we can respond to that. And I really think we can, if you want to look at the so-called those leaders who are responsible, you mentioned before, but I would argue that you have to deal with the entire society, civic society. For example, what is the role of the media when they use interchangeably a freedom fighter or a commando to describe a terrorist and so on. So I think we have to put some order in terms of who are the perpetrators and what are the root causes, how can you deal with that, and what can you do in the short term and the longer term. Anyway, I have a number of experts here, and I would like to recognize them. For identify yourself simply for the record and ask a question if you can, or a quick comment.
Hi, my name is Scott Savrin, and I'm an instructor at King Abdullah Academy here in Virginia. And I'm wondering, just on this level, on this question of integration, and Mr. Wine had mentioned education, and I'm wondering, and of course the need to teach people liberal values, European values, and this type of thing. But I'm also wondering, from this perspective of education, and this is something I think maybe Dr. Jahan Robert mentioned as well, or at least touched upon, this identity crisis, and has there been any effort in the European curriculum itself to help integrate these people? So you have just a huge demographic shift in Europe now with so many Muslim communities, and to what extent are we seeing a shift also in humanities and social sciences, where we're saying we're seeing migrant children, sons of migrants, daughters of migrants, being taught that, well, this is their country too. They're also Europeans. And I bring up my experience because I teach in an Islamic school, and when I teach American history, I teach it from the perspective of, well, this is your history too. So I was wondering if any of the panelists can speak to any shifts in the curriculum of education in order to help integrate these people. Thank you.
Anyone?
I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. So I'm barely aware of what academic literature there is on this. But certainly I am aware, because of the work I'm doing at the Council of Europe, because I've got another role there as well as monitoring member states' compliance with conventions, and which is as the advisor to the Human Rights Commissioner, Niels Mužniek, and one of his concerns is about the integration of migrants and the way that they're treated and the way that their children are or are not being schooled, particularly those that are awaiting entry into Europe, in other words, being held in Turkey or elsewhere because the process now of getting into Europe is, for those who are applying officially, is elongated. And therefore, one of the things we've been looking at is education in European values, as well as just education for children in the refugee camps, so that when they get to Europe, they can integrate much faster into the school system. And the same as professional training for the parents, language training. I mean, somebody coming from Iraq or something who doesn't have the language skills of the country he wants to go to is not going to be employable for quite a while. So it's only recently that there has been a concerted effort at a regional level to address the issue of integration. And of course, if you fail to do that, then you start to get identity crisis. But the identity crisis affects much more the second generation rather than the first generation. So what we see with many of the the jihadi terrorists in Europe is that they're of the second generation, and they are, for whatever reasons, going through some identity crisis. You know, they Muslims first, or they are Belgians, or whatever, and that is one of the contributing factors that tips them into radicalization.
Okay.
Well, if I may just respond to that, I'm very sorry, but I couldn't actually disagree more with you, and I apologize for that. But talking about refugees camp, actually it's not that we're failing to do that, it's that we're not doing it plain and simple. The only socio-educative measures that we've been doing, they were implemented in Germany, as far as I know. In France, there were like some kind of good intentions, but nothing has been implemented yet. And the only things which has been done was only just to teach basic elementary French, but really like basic. So we're not talking. We're not talking about European values or European education there or European history, not at all. We're really far from that. And yes, that would be needed, but we're really like, I mean, this is really like another discussion. We're not talking at the same level. So just to answer very briefly to your question, unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. There's absolutely no initiatives about that. We're not even able to have like European common history manual in Europe, within the EU. MEP Geremek, so at the European Parliament, tried in 2002, I mean, until unfortunately he passed away in a terrible accident in 2005. So he tried really like to implement this kind of efforts to come up with a common history manual. Finally, the only results that we managed to get was a common German and French manual, but we're far away from having like a European common history. And I'm 38 years old, and I can tell you that unfortunately the way that I've been taught like history, it was still nos ancêtres les Gaulois, and this is a shame. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to take the opportunity to ask our colleagues from the Potomac here, the fellows. After all, I think you are the future generation of scholars and scientists and people dealing with technology. When we had the meeting last month with the European members of Parliament, also they are the future, as I mentioned, leaders, and they were interested in the future and what's the role of technology and science, for example. Anyone would like to? Yes, Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine Schiller-Worcester, Potomac. Sure. Catherine Schiller-Worcester, Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. We have a group called the Center for Revolutionary Scientific Thought, and one of the things that we focused on is looking at emerging technologies like big data analytics, artificial intelligence, ubiquitous sensors, the Internet of Things. All of these, I mean, we all carry around sensors with us every day that are generating a lot of data about us and our ideas and our patterns of behavior. So I think there's a lot of potential for technology to help solve some of the manpower problems, I think, with prediction. The volume issue with the numbers of people that are being monitored. I think data analytics can help with some of that. But of course, there's going to be a lot of privacy and civil liberties issues associated with that.
Milton, 1 second. Get the mic, please, first.
Milton Hode.
Use the mic, please.
The mic, okay. Hello, Mike. For Dr. Lesser, you mentioned a concern with overcollection of data, which goes along what you just said about ubiquitous sensors, overcollection of data. How do your attitudes, which I've really appreciated very much, your statement, how do they go over in the Homeland Security Department, those attitudes? How does it go over there?
Actually, we are having a very constructive dialogue, but it's true. Whenever we think about forms of cooperation, future forms of cooperation, privacy and data protection becomes an issue sooner or later, and we are constantly struggling in a very positive way to come to joint solutions which accept the limits of our German and European data protection law, and at the same time deliver the results which are being needed from a law enforcement perspective. And the over-collection of data, that is a good example, because it's a legal principle in Germany and in Europe that there must not be any over-collection of data if the data is not actually needed for a certain purpose. And here in the US, there is a pragmatic approach which comes to the very same result, because it's not about having a lot of data, it's about having accurate data, and it's about having helpful data which allows you to analyze whatever you want to analyze. But so what I wanted to say is that we're approaching each other in some form, and that maybe also due to the Snowden revelations, it's very well known here that we Germans and Europeans do have a privacy issue, and that this is always a key challenge which needs to be solved whenever we enter into a new form of cooperation. I also have to say that sometimes a cooperation which would be helpful from a law enforcement point of view cannot be conducted due to privacy issues, or not in the form which we would like to have it from a law enforcement point of view. But the overall conclusion would be that there is a lot of understanding on the US side, and that we on the German side, together with our American colleagues, try to find creative solutions. For example, through pseudonymization and other technological tools which allow us to hit no-hit procedures, for example, which allow us to cooperate in a privacy-friendly way.
Thank you very much. Since the clock is ticking, and Sean Gray will make the final comments, but if I may ask the fellows at the Potomac to identify themselves, what they are working on, not speeches, just to tell us about their plans, because in 5-10 years they are going to be the leaders. Would you please?
Sure. My name is Luke Kozlowski. I'm a research fellow with the Potomac Institute. I started in March. We went through, Derek and I went through the same CREST class, the Center for Revolutionary and Scientific Thought, together. This week I've been working on a cyber warfare TIM on increasing tactical training of cyber in the Pacific. But in general, I just support a lot of the projects and contracts that we do at Potomac, so that's who I am.
Hi, I'm Paul Sires, also a research fellow, also a graduate, you could say, of the CREST program. Currently, my focus is hardware security and also public-private partnerships, how the government can collaborate better with industry to produce innovation and new technologies that are beneficial for both.
Anyone else there?
My name is Derek Denning. I'm a new research associate in the Science and Technology Policy Division as well. I'm currently working in the hardware security portfolio, but I'm interested in some new projects that could be coming down the pipeline as well, pertaining to NASA studies as well. So, thanks.
Okay, we'll ask our interns who just arrived to identify themselves, the school, and their area of interest.
Hi, my name is Nicole Heitzenrother. I'm a rising junior at Georgetown University, and I'm studying international politics and international security.
My name is Jillian Goldberg. I just graduated from the University of Michigan, and I studied international studies.
My name's Sally Ancheva, and I go to Stetson University. I study political science and global development, and I'm interested in international relations, specifically Europe, NATO, counterterrorism policy. My dad was actually a representative of the Ministry of Interior and law enforcement in Bulgaria at the Embassy of Bulgaria. So that's how I got interested in that.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Heen. I'm a rising senior at the University of Virginia, and I study foreign affairs and anthropology.
Hi, my name is Michael Keane. I'm a rising junior at Emory University, and I study Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies and Arabic.
Hi, my name is Zach Wiesen. I am a rising sophomore at Wichita State University, and I study international studies.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Thorpe. I'm a rising senior at the University of Georgia, majoring in criminal justice and economics. I also have a minor in French. My interest is in violent extremism and countering violent rebel entities.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Poggle, and I'm a rising junior at Harvard University. I study biochemistry, but my dad was a Marine for 30 years, so I kind of got interested in international security through that.
Hi, my name is Sharon. I'm a research associate and coordinator here at the International Center for Terrorism Studies. And I, as well as the entire team, helped Professor Alexander with all different projects that ICTS coordinates, including seminars and publications. Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else?
See if our colleagues have anything to say.
Well, I asked them, you know.
Pass the mic down. That's it.
My name is Georgi Ovcharov, and I'm Bulgarian police liaison officer. I'm presenting Bulgarian Ministry of Interior in the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
Hi, I'm Colonel Sotirios Petropoulos. I'm the Deputy Defense Attaché of Greece, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Gamini Kirvella.
We ready to wrap
Well,
up?
you know, I'm looking at the clock.
Yeah, well, you're only 5 minutes late.
It's not too bad.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all the panel and all of you really for what I thought was a very, very. Yeah, I want to thank all of the panel for very, very fine presentations, and certainly thank everybody for your contributions. I have a few thoughts here for our younger folks here who, as Jonas says, are going to be the leaders of the future. When you think about political correctness and many of the other topics that were brought up today by all of the speakers, what you may be witnessing, in my humble view, is a battle between certain ideas and certain things that are going on and the overall democratic process, the overall idea of freedom and democracy and how we grew from a republic to a democratic thought process in Europe and really under the mantle of Western civilization as we know it and the like. And maybe that's a conflict, because many of the things that we were taught or we took for granted when I went to school, which was a long, long, long time before you, but there were certain things that you believed in and certain things that you did. You were taught, for example, to treat others like you treat yourself, and not just as it is expressed in our Bible and the like, but just generally speaking. You also were taught to respect other people. You grew up with a real understanding of immigrants and what they were, because we were all immigrants. My grandfolks came from Switzerland and through New York City, and then went forward and worked and the like. And we have on my father's side, that was my mother's side. My father's side, we were Scotch-Irish. Some say way back there was a cattle thief in the family. I don't know about that, but my point is that we learned the language, we learned the values. We were Americans. We belonged to the United States, and the rest of it was all secondary. We maybe had our beliefs and the like. My grandfather, for example, never did think that Germany would not win World War II. He was, grew up with that discipline, that thought process. He thought we were too easy and the like. And so you have those kinds of thought processes amongst all nations and all peoples. And somehow along the way we've forgotten a little bit about how to treat other people and think about it and the like. And we tend to label them, and we need to watch that. We also need to understand, you young people in particular, that we can learn an awful lot from our colleagues from other countries and nations about any topic you want to bring up, whether it's physics, chemistry, or terrorism. For example, when I was a young guy, I had the opportunity to study all of the terrorist-type techniques and activities from all of the European countries. And I can tell you that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was nobody better than that small Dutch outfit they had as far as countering terrorism and the work they did against the trains and the like. There was no one any better than the German border police in those days who were thinking about terrorist-type activities in those days. We all are well aware of the French experience and the knowledge they have and the like, particularly in Africa and places like that. Certainly the United Kingdom with the Special Air Service and with the Special Forces and all that, they paved the way for a lot of the kind of techniques. And in those days, only the military was really worried about this kind of thing. The rest of society called it anti-terrorism, not counterterrorism. And then gradually it all now is back into the envelope of counterterrorism. So we can learn a lot from our colleagues, and I can tell you right now, we won't win this thing over the long haul unless we have international cooperation, international trust, international confidence. We're going to make some mistakes along the way because it's a lousy carpenter doesn't drive it, hit his thumb with a hammer once in a while. He's not driving any nails. But we'll win this thing. We just have to stay with it. And so that's my thought process. And thank you all again for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.